In this lesson, we are going to be talking about project and code guidelines, and we are going to be following this Reboot Android guidelines, which is pretty common. It's pretty well known. You might have already heard of it. Now, why do we need guidelines and code styling? They are really important because when you work in a team, it allows you to have consistent code styling, consistent code within the project, or maybe within multiple projects. So it's easier to jump from one project to another because the code has the same structure, seems already similar. So this already applies to the project itself that you are working on. So you want to have the same style in the project that you are working on. You don't want part of it to have a certain style, a certain guideline, and maybe another part to have a different guideline, or maybe no guideline, because it's going to be difficult for you to jump between features. And the same applies to different projects. So in a team, when you have the same guideline and the same styling of the code, this really simplifies the way that you work. It really saves a lot of time, and the projects that you are going to be switching are already going to seem familiar to you. Now, we have this guideline from Reboot here, and we are going to skim really quickly through it. And what I really recommend you to do is basically at the end of this lecture, take this URL. I'm going to save it in the project resources so you can find it, and reread again the guidelines and the code styling, and just go through it again on your own terms and try to make it for yourself which of them you want to follow, which of them you don't want to follow, because as you'll see, we won't be actually talking about all of them. There are some that are really important. There are some that I really don't consider to be that important. So it's really important for you to take this with a grain of salt and try to analyze and decide for yourself which of these are really going to be your guideline, your coding style. And once you have such a style, once you have such a guideline, you can also internalize it and add it to your company, to your own colleagues, and share this with them. Now, of course, that if you have already a guideline, I still recommend you having a quick look. Maybe you find out some new stuff. Also, you'll see that the guideline has Android and Java references. But even if you are using Kotlin, I still recommend you going into this guideline because most of them still apply to Kotlin. There will be just some minor exceptions. Now, without further ado, let's go into it and let's have a quick look. Let's just skim through them and see which of them really seem important. Now, of course, that the class file is kind of an Android or Java 101. You want to use the upper camel case convention here for classes. I think that this is decent enough and you should do it wherever you can. That's really important. Now, for resources files, you should use the underscore and having all the time lowercase. That's pretty important and decent, and I guess that most of us already do such a convention. Now, for drawables, this is really important because I've had projects with a lot of drawables, with a lot of assets, and they used to have different namings. They didn't have a convention. So if you have, for example, a button, you want all your drawables and assets to start with button like this. If you have an icon, you want all of them to start with icon. Doing so, your resources are going to look much more organized, and it's going to be much easier for you to find an asset and to identify by type that asset is. So this applies to all types like menu, tabs, and so on, but it's a really good rule of thumb to follow such a style because you'll find resources easier. Now, going into conventions for icons, this is again pretty similar. Or for example, if you're using Android Studio, it will automatically generate this kind of styling for you. But still, if you are importing them for a project, like from an external resource, you should make sure that you have some kind of styling for the namings. For example, the icons always start with icon and then underscore, and you can see here we have an example. Now, for selector states, this is pretty important as well. It's easy for you to identify which state is which, and you have all of these selector states here and all of these examples, and maybe you can identify and implement this in your project as well. Now, going to the layout files, this again, if you generate activities or fragments with Android Studio, with that wizard that it has, you're going to probably end up with these namings here, and also for the activity itself. And you won't have to really take this into account. But if you create the layouts by yourself, you want to make sure that the layout for activity starts with activity, the layout for the fragment starts with fragment. It's just a general rule of thumb to follow this kind of convention. Now, let's go and skip these menu files for now. There is a very important rule here. and that is doesn't ignore exceptions. And this kind of idea is pretty similar to what I've told you about trying to let the application crash. So we had a discussion about nullability, and in case you have a variable that shouldn't be null but it is null, you should let the app crash so you can find the problem, the bug, so you can fail fast. Now this is something similar, not the same, but is similar in terms of you should never like catch an exception and don't do anything with it. You should have some kind of logic. So if an exception has been thrown, well, something has gone wrong. You've probably tried to parse a wrong value and you need to do something. You can either send a report, you can either recover from this point. But this is important because it allows your project to recover from errors. If you hide them by doing nothing, like we can see in these brackets here, well, it's not very nice because you don't know that the app has recovered. It's just going to stay in some kind of gray area state. So as a good rule of thumb, you should try to do this and not ignore exceptions like this one. It's pretty important. As you can see here in this explanation, it tells you that you might be creating mine codes for your code, and in case someone trips over them at some point, it'll be pretty nasty. But again, this is something similar with what I told you about the nullable values. All right, the same goes for generic exceptions. So if you have multiple pieces of code, it's easy for you to just wrap them in one try catch and have a generic exception. But this is not a very good idea because you'll never know in this block here where you actually handle the error. You don't know which was the source of the error. So you don't know if the source was this IO function, if it was this parsing function or a security function. So you want to make sure that you catch each exception individually so you can have a handling system, a handling case for each type of exception. Now, let's go a bit and skip the qualifiers because the imports are usually done automatically by Android Studio, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. We are going to have a quick look at style rules for Java. And again, if you're in Kotlin, there are still some of these that still apply. I don't want to go in the Hungarian notation for private variables with the M. I really don't like that. So basically it tells you that it's a non-static field, but this has been disagreed by Google and I wouldn't really go with this. What it's still important is if you have static final constants, like in the companion object of the Kotlin analogy, you're gonna make sure that you want to have all caps and underscores for constants. Now, let's skip this for a bit and get to these acronyms as words chapter because this is really important. I've seen this done many times. If you have this kind of acronyms here like URL, right? You do not want to do this. If you do this, well, you kind of violate the whole camel case convention for the variables. You don't want to do that, right? You want to have like this as a word. You want to treat it as a word. For example, the customer ID, we know that this is an acronym, but in code, you shouldn't treat it as an acronym because you can end up with something like this. I mean, if I see this in my code as a variable, I'm surely gonna discard it. I don't really want to see this kind of variable within my code. So a good rule of thumb is to treat acronyms as words. Now, regarding the spaces, I wouldn't really spend too much time on this because Android Studio already kind of takes care of that if you use the shortcut for reformatting that I told you about in a previous lesson. Now, going into the brace style, again, this is something that is more or less important. For example, they argue here that this is a bad way of actually having the conditions. I mean, the code shouldn't be on a separate line if it has only one line. I personally disagree with this. I find this much more readable than this. But again, this is to your own personal taste. This is something subjective. I wouldn't make a guideline out of this. You should probably agree with your colleagues or yourself to which one of them you're going to use. Now, going to annotations, this is pretty important if you're using Dagger, for example. So any kind of dependency injection framework, it might have some annotations. And you'll see that your class might have multiple annotations. And you want to make sure that if you have annotations, multiple annotations for a class, you want to place them on separate lines like this, so they're more readable. Now, if you have a variable with several annotations like this one here, the data manager, you can actually inline them like this and it's fine. It's okay. It's a bit different from the class. But again, this is not that important. I wouldn't really treat this as a golden rule. Now, going into the actual more important stuff. So let's skip that logging guidelines. They are important, but I would not spend too much time on that. I want to get here to a very important piece, and that is class member ordering. And I've talked to you about this already, and I hope that you have already got the gist of it. Now we are going to be talking a bit more in detail. As you can see, we have some kind of ordering, and by having such ordering for the components of a class, you can create a consistent structure for all your classes. And if you do so, you kind of transform all your classes into something familiar. It's going to be easier for you to jump into new classes. You are going to know where to look for a constant, where to look for a constructor, where to look for private methods. So you know that private methods are going to be at the bottom of the class, the constants and the fields should be at the top of the class, and so that's really a really good idea. If you have them mixed up in several classes, well, as a developer, you might end up having to read all the classes, all the content of the classes, and it's just better to have this kind of preparedness for knowing where the actual components are within a class. And as you remember, first should be the constants, then the fields, the constructors, and then the override methods and callbacks. And only after that, you have the public methods, the private methods, and the inner classes or interfaces. So if you follow such a rule, that's great. You can actually automate this with Android Studio if you spend a bit of time. But if you do this, we have an example here, you will end up with more consistent code within your classes. And that's a very good thing. Now, this example doesn't really provide all of those components here, but it's an idea. As you can see, you have the Android lifecycle first as an overridden method, the fields here, which are the first, and like the priority, which is the constant itself. And only after those, you get the private methods and the inner classes. Now, there is something really important on Android, at least. You have in activities or fragments, you have the lifecycle callbacks, right? And you want to treat those in order. So if in your activity here, you have multiple lifecycle callbacks, you want to have them ordered in the order that they really come from the system. So we know the Android 101 is that we should know the order of these callbacks. We know that onCreate should be triggered before onResume, and onPause before onResume, and onDisplay should be the last one. So you should basically stick with the actual order that they are called by the system, and this allows you to have a more linear idea on what happens within the code. You know that the code within the onCreate here is going to be executed first, and then the onResume code, and then the onPause, and then the onDestroy. So that's a very good rule of thumb. I really recommend you to do this. And again, these are overridden methods. They should be first before public or private methods. Now, there's something really important in the parameter ordering for Android, at least. You want to make sure that the first parameter in a method, in the list of parameters as we can have here, is the context. And the last should be the callback. Now, of course, that sometimes you won't have them, but if you have them, try to make sure to have the context first, because it's pretty important, and the callback last, because you might be using trailing lambdas on Kotlin, and so. Now, let's also take a quick look at constants, naming, and values, because this chapter here is important. It allows you to kind of conceptualize how to name your constants, and in big projects you're going to have a lot of constants. You're going to have constants for bundle, for intent, for extra, for arguments, for preferences, and if you follow a prefix, a custom prefix like we can see here, it's going to be really easy for you to understand in the code which constant you should use and where you can look for them. We have an example here, as you can see, and that's fine. Now, something that again is important is related to the arguments of fragments and activities. Of course, that for an activity, you should pass the intent in which you can actually start the activity. So you can use the intent to start a new activity. You should want to make sure that the intent is extracted to a separate method. So I would honestly go in the activity, create a static method like this one, and have a getStart intent here, and pass all the intent parameters that I want as parameters here. And by doing so, you kind of externalize the content creation for this activity. So in order to launch it, you need several parameters sent. Instead of having this code copy-pasted wherever you need to launch that activity, you can have it already as a static method in the activity in one place, and that's just much better. Now, for fragments, it's pretty similar, but you also have an advantage. You can actually return an instance of the fragment. So what you can do, you can create in the fragment class a static method, like you can see here, called new instance. I actually use this, it's really useful, and pass all the parameters that that fragment needs in order to display. So as you can see here, we pass them, we create a fragment, and by having such a static method, you can make sure that all the other pieces in your app call this new instance static method, and you don't have, I don't know, maybe somebody trying to pass only 1 or 2 arguments. So if they use the new instance method, you can make a discipline out of this. You can make sure that the fragment will be always instantiated with the correct arguments. Now, let's go a bit at the line length. We know that we don't want to have them over 100 characters. Well, that's already highlighted by Android Studio, so that's fine. If we go here to line wrapping, again, this is fine, but if you refactor your code with the shortcut that I've told you about, this is going to be automatic, so you don't have to do it manually all the time. But one of the last thing is this with the chain. If you remember, we had to do a lot of operations on lists, and we used those Kotlin collection operators, and we chained them. Now, how we did, we chained them here like this, one after another, as you can see, as we have this Picasso example here, because it improves readability. Now, if you look at the counter example, which is this one here, well, it doesn't make too much sense. It's much harder to read, while this one is much easier to read because you can see that you have one action, second action, third action. So I really recommend you to chain this kind of operators on separate lines. It makes the code much readable, even though you lose some code lines. That's fine. Now, the same with long parameters here. If you have a method that takes a lot of parameters, I would actually suggest you try to limit the number of parameters for a method. If the method has 10 parameters or actually over 4 or 5 parameters, that's a sign that maybe you should encapsulate that data in a special class, in a special holder. But let's say that you have such a method for some reason, and it would be a better idea to basically break all the parameters on separate lines, like this load picture method here does. That's really cool. Now, going into the Args Java chain styling, which again, it tells you that you should have the operators on a new line. That's basically the same thing that we did for Kotlin collection operators, and it's kind of an abstract thing. You can apply it wherever you have operators. Now, for XML style rules, this is important because you don't want to go having, for example, for a text view, having a separate tagline like this one. It just doesn't really work that way. It's easier for you to have a closing tagline like this one, and it's just much faster, less code for you to actually maintain. Now, going into resource namings, this is interesting because this doesn't apply to Kotlin. Now, if you have Java in your project, in your code, you might be getting the views with defined view by ID method, which is pretty common. So you can use these prefixes, which are really good to have a uniformize in terms of view namings. As you can see here, if you have an image view, you start with the image prefix. If you have a text, you start with a text, with a button like this, and so. But if you have Kotlin in your code, I don't really recommend you doing so. I recommend you going into an actual camel case approach. So instead of having image underscore profile with a small letter like this one, you should use image and then a capital letter P and then profile. So you should basically just follow the actual variable convention that you have, because you will be accessing the views with Kotlin synthetic. So you're not going to use in Kotlin find view by ID. That's just not going to help you. You should use the Kotlin synthetic and just reference the views directly in your code, in your classes. So that's just a gist of it. This doesn't really apply to Kotlin. Now, in strings, again, you should try to split the strings to have errors, message, title. So you should do this kind of prefix to kind of have them in separate categories. That's really going to be helpful for you. And apart from attributes ordering, which is more of a custom view importance, I would honestly stick to what is discussed so far, because this lesson has been already pretty long. And we're not going to talk about unit tests right now. I'm going to have a separate lesson on this, and we're going to talk there about how to template your test names, as you can see here, and I'm going to have a more detailed explanation there. So this has been pretty much everything. Now, as I recommended, I would really urge you to go through this guideline again on your own and try to make for yourself which of these rules are really for you and which of them you really want to stick with. You don't have to stick with all of them. It's just a guideline. Of course, you don't have to really enforce all of them to be applied.